Good afternoon. My presentation is going to be on the book, The Color of Water, A Black Man's Tribute to His White Mother by James McBride. This is an extraordinary book that gives the life and history of a single mom raising 12 children. And oddly enough, the title of the book, The Color of Water, came from a question that James asked his mother when he was younger, when he asked her, "What color is Jesus?" And she replied, "Jesus is the color of water." James McBride is the 8th child of 12 children. He is also the last child of his father, Mr. McBride. James is a musician and a writer. A few other books he wrote: The Good Lord Bird, Song Yet Sung, Miracle at St. Anne's, which Spike Lee produced into a movie. As a child, James struggled with his identity because his mother never talked about her past, never talked about her parents, her siblings, or anyone. That was a part of her life that she just put in the back of her mind and never dealt with. It was only through constant nagging and persistence by James that she finally gave in and told her story. It was not until then that James realized that he was Jewish African American. His mother was born April 1st, 1921 in Poland. And I apologize for not learning, but I could not correctly pronounce her Jewish names at birth in Poland. However, when her father moved to the United States in Virginia, he changed her name to Rachel Deborah Silsky. Her older brother was named Sam, and her younger sister was named Dee Dee. And eventually, when she moved and settled in New York, she changed her name to Ruth Silsky prior to getting married. As I stated, Ruth never talked about her family, so James was constantly wondering who were her parents, who were her siblings, what was her life like in Virginia, and why did she leave for Harlem to start over. As a child, most of Ruth's life revolved around her father's store in Virginia. She worked first thing in the morning, before school, and after school. The only time that they didn't work in the store was on the Sabbath, from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. And that was the only time she got a break from working in the store. But other than that, everything revolved around the store. That was all her dad was concerned about. The problems that Ruth faced started with her father, who sexually abused her. He had no love for her or her siblings. His marriage to her mom was simply out of obligation because he was a rabbi, and it was sort of expected at the time. And these problems that arise from her father are problems that she later on in life pushed to the back of her mind and never visited again until the writing of this book. As a Jewish woman in America during that era, she practically had no rights as a woman. She didn't own any property, couldn't own any property, her or her mother. They had no stake in the store that her father owned, and he kept all the money to himself. He spent very little money on his family. She was also brought to a country that was racially divided, where the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants hated the Jews and they hated African Americans. And eventually some of the Jews began to hate the African Americans as well, even though they both were considered outcasts in the eyes of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Theories, systems, ecological theory. As a part of a divided nation, her environment constantly changed. This started from the time her family left Poland and came to America. Her name changed. She had to settle and get accustomed to things in Virginia. And then later on, her environment changed again when she moved to New York and dealt with that environment. But in New York, it was not so much that she was Jewish, as more she was considered a white woman in an area that was predominantly African American. Her resilience, her ability to raise 12 children in Harlem, New York, on her own, keep them in high school, and get them all through college. This shows a strength of an individual, of a mother that refused to settle for anything less than perfection for her children, which leads to her strength. Throughout all her struggles in life, her loss and surviving of 2 husbands, her family disowning her, to the point that they had a Jewish ceremony, which pretty much like a ceremony that they have when someone dies. That they literally cut her off from the family, and in their mind, she did not exist. But regardless of this, she persevered and took care of her children. She ensured that they had food, clothing. She ensured that they stayed in school, and she wanted them to get into best schools. And the only other thing more important in school, was that they stayed in church. The literature that I used relates to the things that Ruth dealt with during her lifespan, not just as a Jewish individual in Virginia, but as a Jewish white woman in Harlem, New York, where she still faced ridicule and the discrimination from African Americans. Even though she married African Americans, both of her husbands were African Americans, and with her first husband, they actually started a church in New York, which they started in their living room and eventually moved into a building. But even through all this, she was still looked at and frowned upon as a white woman in a predominantly African American neighborhood. Also, with the issues of being abused by her father, something that really didn't matter to most people, because fathers, men, pretty much did what they wanted during that time. And the struggles of being Jewish, and the one literature that I have here with Senator Tom Cotton Heflin in Alabama, it just relates to the issue of the struggles and how at one point it was against the law for white Americans and African Americans to marry. For personal reflections, you look at the abuse that she dealt with from her father, and not being loved, not just not being loved by her father, but her aunts mainly had no love for her as well. When she went to New York, she stayed with them, but they just tolerated her because she was the daughter of the crippled sibling. And once she became of age, they didn't want anything to do with her, especially when she married an African American. And not being loved is what led her, not intentionally, but led her to fall in love with an African American male, because this was the first time she ever experienced being loved. This wasn't something that she did out of spite of her father, but in a sense, cliche, she didn't see color. She was comfortable around African Americans, because even though she was ridiculed by some of them, for the most part, they treated her like she was family, because they understood of being outcast. And as I stated, she was dead to her family because she married an African American, to the point that her mother was gravely ill and ended up in New York in the hospital, and she wanted to go see her mom. They told her, "Don't come. You're dead to us." And as I stated before, you know, her true love was being around African Americans. Um, Even though during her life she never talked about race, she never mentioned it, she never associated with it, she never took one side over the other. Her concern was just raising her children, and that was her resilience. Her strength lied in her ability to constantly rise above the problems that she faced in her life. You know, the death of her husbands, and constantly moving forward and getting her kids through college, and eventually getting herself through college. And oddly enough, she became a social worker. This book was very interesting to me, a good read, an excellent read, I would say. And I highly encourage you to read this book. And if you're interested, let me know. You can borrow mine.